Hello. How's everyone's day so far? Great conference? Yes. Thanks for being here. Okay, let's get started. My name is Bahar Shatpur. I'm the Director of Policy and Communications at the Canadian Centre for Housing Rights, which was formerly known as the Centre for Equality, Rights and Accommodation, also known as CERA. So it's a pleasure to be here today. So I just want to welcome everyone in person and those who are joining us virtually. And just reminding all virtual participants that they can submit questions during the Q&A session below in the tab below the live stream, which will be asked on their behalf during the discussion period. So I would like to read a land acknowledgement before we start. We acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and now is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, Métis peoples, and we also acknowledge that the City of Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Okay. So before I introduce our speakers, I would like to take a few minutes to reflect on the incredible advocacy of many people across the country to advance the right to housing. While I know there's still a lot to be done to truly realize the right to housing in Canada, getting to where we are today, where our governments have committed to advancing the right to housing was not an easy task. The passing of the National Housing Strategy in 2017, the passing of the domestic legislation of the right to housing in 2019 by the passing of the National Housing Strategy Act was a result of many years of advocacy by communities impacted by housing issues and housing advocates across the country. I'd like to highlight one of those important efforts, and some of you were part of those efforts as well. So in early 2010, individuals who had experienced poverty and homelessness, as well as CERA, launched a legal challenge against the federal and provincial governments represented by the Advocacy Centre for Tenants of Ontario. This legal challenge argued that the governments of Canada and Ontario violated the Charter of Rights and Freedoms by failing to address and contributing to a growing homelessness and inadequate housing crisis. It was a landmark legal challenge that invigorated a widespread right to housing movement across Canada. Unfortunately, the courts dismissed the case over and over again. They never heard the thousands of pages of evidence that clearly demonstrated the failure of our governments to address the systemic housing causes of housing inadequacy and homelessness. But the case sparked the growth of a strong right to housing movement that brought together housing advocates and lived experts, pushing our governments to recognize and implement the right to housing. There was a time when the right to adequate home was a taboo word in government. It still is in some parts of the government today. And our demands were sidelined, and we were labeled as human rights idealists who wanted too much. Of course, everyone persisted to make their demands loud and clear. There were protests, media appearances, lots of different events across the country. Because we all have the right to live in a safe home, a well-maintained home that is affordable, that is secure, and that we end the gross violation of the right to housing that is homelessness, so people can all live with dignity. So I think it's important to recognize this history and the work of many before 2010, because to claim the right to housing starts from the ground up. It's a grassroots effort based on the tireless commitment of many communities and housing advocates who dared to push for their social and economic right to housing to be recognized. And it is absolutely imperative that we continue building on the movement to ensure that the right to housing is implemented, because everyone in Canada deserves to live in a secure, affordable, and adequate home. So with that said, I would like to introduce our speakers. So we have Ruby Bissett, who's a research analyst at the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate, where she works to help the advocate fulfill their duties tied to receiving and analyzing submissions regarding systemic housing issues. She has a background in social work and public policy and also works in a part-time capacity at a safe house with youth experiencing homelessness. Ruby is a settler living in the unceded territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Chilwauton nations, known colonially as Vancouver, BC. And today she will be our first presenter and will give an introduction to the office and how the Federal Housing Advocate is working to advance the right to housing for all in Canada. Thank you. And we also have Jessica Lussier, who is a research analyst at the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate. Just like Ruby, she contributes to the reception and analysis of housing submissions. Her research background has been focusing on international policy surrounding human rights, more specifically refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants' rights. She will be the second presenter, giving an overview of the housing submission tool, the analytical process, and the identification of systemic housing issues for reviews. Thank you. And then we have Michelle Biss, who is the National Director of the National Right to Housing Network. As an expert in economic and social rights, she has presented at several United Nations treaty body reviews and at Canadian parliamentary committees. Prior to her work at the NRHN, Michelle was the policy director and human rights lawyer at Canada Without Poverty. She has extensive professional experience working for marginalized groups, particularly women, persons with disabilities, newcomers, and Indigenous persons, through casework, research, and community legal education. She's a human rights lawyer and was called to the Ontario Bar in 2014. And last but not least is Sahar Raza, who's the Director of Policy and Communications for the National Right to Housing Network. As a daughter of immigrants and racial justice advocates, she has been working to amplify marginalized voices for as long as she can remember. She holds a master's degree in communications and culture and has a decade of experience in research, policy analysis, and communication, all focused on tackling systemic issues rooted in colonialism, discrimination, and privatization. She now works to build a more equitable and just society through the implementation of a fundamental human right, the right to adequate housing. So thanks to all the speakers. And with that said, I will invite our first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Bahar, and thank you everyone for your interest in our session. We're going to start by just showing a quick 2-minute video that gives an overview of the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate. And I just want to invite all the people who are standing in the back. I've seen like maybe 1 or 2 seats around here, or maybe they're full now, I don't know. But if you want to sit down, like, don't be shy.
Housing is a fundamental human right. Having a safe and secure place to call home helps people and families thrive and succeed. It is central to human dignity, well-being, and community. But a home is more than just a roof and 4 walls. It is protection from the elements, and it is a means to access basic services. It also keeps us safe and healthy. The right to housing means many things. For example, it means you're able to get adequate housing that is affordable and meets your needs. It means you can access housing without discrimination or harassment, and you feel safe in your home. It also means your home should be accessible, like if you have a disability or you're an older person. Many people in Canada still live in housing that does not meet these standards, and many do not have a place to live at all. The National Housing Strategy Act recognizes housing as a fundamental human right. It commits governments to focus on those in greatest housing need, to reform housing laws, policies, and programs through a human rights-based approach, and to involve communities in meaningful ways. The Act also establishes a national housing strategy with accountability tools to help develop and maintain the strategy, including the National Housing Council and the Federal Housing Advocate. The Federal Housing Advocate's mandate is to promote and protect the right to housing across Canada. The Advocate gives those impacted by housing need and homelessness a voice. The Advocate receives submissions from the public on systemic housing issues and uses that information to make recommendations to improve Canada's housing laws, policies, and programs. The Advocate can review the issue. In some cases, they will refer to the National Housing Council. The Council will establish a review panel to examine the issue more closely and make recommendations. The Advocate doesn't help with individual disputes. If you need help resolving a dispute, you need to go to the Landlord Tenant Board or Human Rights Commission in your province or territory. To make a submission to the Advocate or to find out more about what we do, visit the housing page on the Canadian Human Rights Commission website.
Okay. If you haven't noticed, the Federal Housing Advocate is sitting in the front row, so she's a little bit embarrassed that we have her picture projected up here. So this is Marie-Josée Houle. She's the Federal Housing Advocate, and she was appointed in February of this year. Sorry. In all areas of her mandate, the Advocate will take a systemic and participatory approach with a focus on priority groups. So this means that the Advocate does not take on individual cases, but will advocate for changes to laws, policies, and programs that affect the right to housing. So instead of realizing the right to housing for one person at a time, these changes will improve access to adequate housing for people across Canada. Taking a participatory approach means working with individuals and communities directly affected by homelessness and inadequate housing. The work of the Federal Housing Advocate focuses on groups facing systemic disadvantage in housing, and this is guided by the priority groups identified in the National Housing Strategy Act. Our office continues to expand this list, recognizing that other groups also face disproportionate homelessness and inadequate housing, such as lone parent families, refugee claimants, survivors of trauma, and people in conflict with the law. The Act frames the duties and functions of the Advocate in relation to systemic issues. And so for this reason, our office has worked to develop a definition of a systemic issue which helps to guide the work of the Advocate. So a systemic housing issue is an issue which inhibits the full and equal enjoyment of the right to adequate housing in Canada and is rooted in the housing system or other public and private market systems. The Advocate will prioritize systemic housing issues affecting disadvantaged groups. A systemic housing issue can result from or be influenced by actions or inaction by government or private actors related to legislation, policies, programs, and more. And systemic housing issues often intersect with other forms of disadvantage and discrimination, including colonialism, racism, sexism, homophobia, and ableism, and stigmatization or discrimination based on poverty, homelessness, or other social condition. So I'll give a brief overview of the activities of our office to date. So first, the Advocate has a duty to monitor the progressive realization of the right to housing, which includes monitoring of the National Housing Strategy. The office engages with duty bearers at all levels of government, as well as stakeholders and rights holders, especially persons with lived experience of housing precarity and homelessness. As well, we work with academics and experts in the field to conduct research on systemic housing issues. The Advocate also receives submissions from the public on systemic housing issues, which my colleague Jessica will talk a bit more about shortly. And then based on these submissions, research, and engagement, the Advocate may decide to review a specific systemic issue or to refer it to the National Housing Council for a review panel. The Advocate also takes other actions on specific issues, including, for example, letters of concern, trip reports, and recommendations in her annual report. The Advocate's main vehicle for making change is through recommendations to the federal minister responsible for housing. The minister has an obligation to table the advocate's reports in Parliament and to respond to her recommendations. And while the advocate may make recommendations to other levels of government, the federal minister is the only one with this duty to respond. So just to give an overview of some of the big pieces of work and research we've been undertaking. So monitoring the progressive realization of the right to housing, including monitoring the national housing strategy, is one of the functions and priorities of the advocate. And she monitors the progress of the strategy's goals and timelines. This $72 billion 10-year plan is purported to strengthen the middle class, cut chronic homelessness in half, and stimulate our economy. But research has shown that it does not meet the needs of the most disadvantaged groups. This monitoring work is particularly relevant given that this year marks the 5-year anniversary of the strategy's release. In last year's annual report, the advocate reported on how well the strategy was working and made 6 recommendations to revise the strategy. And if you heard her keynote yesterday, you'll know that we're launching a campaign to align it with the human rights commitments of the National Housing Strategy Act. We've also published some fact sheets on the strategy on Homeless Hub. Financialization is a priority issue for the federal housing advocate. The term financialization, just so we're all on the same page, is used to refer to the fact that housing is increasingly treated as a commodity in order to generate maximum profits for investors rather than as a basic right and social good. Early in September, we published a series of research studies on the impact of corporate financial investments in housing in Canada. The reports look at the international context of financialization, the financialization of purpose-built rental housing, as well as experiences and impacts on tenants, racialized communities, and in long-term care settings. This research shows a link between financialization and unaffordable rents, evictions, and with disadvantaged groups being the most affected. And there was a session on this research, really fantastic session on this research this morning at the conference as well. The reports are also available on Homeless Hub. And additionally, on September 22nd, the advocate reviewed the issue of financialization of purpose-built rental to the National Housing Council for their first review panel on the matter. Finally, we've undertaken a research project to look closely at the human rights aspects of homeless encampments in Canada. The office worked with a national network of encampment researchers, which included people with knowledge of the subject based on their lived experiences, as well as academics, advocates, and activists from across Canada. Reports on the encampments will be released shortly, and some of this research, which focuses on encampments in Quebec, was presented in a session at the conference yesterday. The next phase of the project is to engage directly with encampment residents and to help them raise their own human rights concerns through a partnership with the SHIFT.
You're here.
So in order to fulfill the mandate of the advocate, our office engages in partnerships and collaborations with a wide variety of organizations. Not only is it required to engage with people with lived experience and civil society, but we would truly not be able to do this work without their expertise. So I'll just give some examples of our partnerships, and this is a really non-exhaustive list. But we are advised by the Canadian Lived Experience Leadership Network. We work with FRAPRU in Quebec, with the National Right to Housing Network, the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, Keepers of the Circle. We have a partnership with 211, where we're able to direct rights holders with immediate housing needs, and in turn, their navigators can inform callers about our submission tool and encourage them to make submissions. We also have a data partnership with Stats Canada, and they've published 24 fact sheets on their website related to the right to housing. We work with many national Indigenous organizations, collaborate with and between all levels of government, and of course work with the National Housing Council. So we laid the groundwork with a ton of national level engagement, and now that the advocate has been appointed and we've laid the groundwork, we've been able to shift to regional engagement, and the advocate was able to take her inaugural regional visit to British Columbia in August, late August. So this was a visit to Victoria, Prince George, and Vancouver, which allowed us to learn more about current housing rights challenges and opportunities in the region and meet with community organizations and individuals affected by inadequate housing and homelessness. And during the trip, the Advocate focused particularly on financialization, encampments, and Indigenous housing. And this picture is from the Advocate's visit to Moccasin Flats, the encampment in Prince George. We were able to visit several encampments in BC, and it was a very powerful experience. More recently, like last week, the Advocate returned from a visit to the north. She was invited to Nunatsiavut and Nunavut regions of Inuit Nunangat to investigate the housing conditions up there. The host Inuit governments brought the Advocate to many forms of public and private housing, including housing that was meant to serve people with disabilities, the unhoused, women with children fleeing violence, elders housing, and child protective care housing. A trip report will be made available in the new year, but some immediate impressions include that housing up there is in short supply, causing extreme levels of overcrowding. Waiting lists for housing are years long, but the housing isn't necessarily even suitable or in good repair when they get it, and the surrounding community is inaccessible for elders and people with disabilities, leaving residents cooped up for the long winter period. So that concludes my part of our presentation, and I'll invite Jess up to talk about the submission tool. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Jessica. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks Ruby for the first part of this presentation. So you can switch to the next slide, please. Or do I have a clicker? Yep. Click au milieu. Okay, great. So for the second part of this presentation, I'll be talking to you guys about the submission tool. So this is you probably have been hearing about the submission tool during the conference, because we have been telling our partners actually to share the word. I'm seeing a lot of people here that actually talked about it, so that's great. It's a way for you guys to actually contact the Advocate, share your stories, and for us to actually read your stories, right? So it is, like Ruby said, it is part of our mandate. We're to receive submissions from the public on systemic housing issues. So for that reason, the tool was launched officially on May 5th, and we've been receiving submissions since. So it's fairly recent, but we still have, we're getting an idea of what's coming in from who, and then from which issues as well. So I'll talk a little bit about that later. But just for now, to give you an idea of what's the tool, how it works, how to make a submission, right? So the tool could be promoted to pretty much everyone, I guess, because it could be promoted, of course, for people with lived experience of inadequate housing or homelessness that want to share their stories. And inadequate housing, a lot of people are actually experiencing that. So a lot of people are actually able to reach out to us, of course. But it also could be for individuals or organizations who want to express their frustration about wider systemic factors related to housing issues, but also for people or organizations, nonprofit, who want their voices heard on systemic housing issues, even if you haven't experienced it yourself. We've all testified it, so you're welcome to share your stories also if you want to get your voice heard. And then also I wanted to add, because we've been getting the question often, but there are no deadlines to make a submission, so the tool is there to stay as long as the office will be here. It's part of a mandate. The tool will be available online and available for you guys to reach out to us. So how to make actually a submission? There are various ways of doing it. The most, I would say, straightforward way is to go on our website, fill out the form. The form itself is available in French and English. I'll show you a bit, just the next slide, what it looks like. But there are also other ways. So for example, if you don't have access to a computer, but you have access, for example, to a public library, you could just print the downloadable forms, filling out by hand, and just mail it to the Advocates. That's the way. That form is currently available in French and English. We're actually working on a version that would be eventually available in 8 Indigenous languages and maybe other languages eventually. But just assisting to some of the sessions yesterday about data for especially, or surveys for Indigenous people, we've come to realize that maybe the format is not adequate for some. So we're actually very very happy to be able to attend those sessions and to learn from you guys' experience that already have been through that process, right? What else? So that you could also call the number on the screen. We were able to send a paper form by the mail, and then you send it back. But there's also this phone line that you're able to call, and then there's also the option of having an agent on the phone with you filling out the form throughout the whole form. That service is also available in French and English. So this is what it looks like, the first page. So for example, if you get the Canadian Human Rights Commission website, you click on housing on top, then you go in resources, that tab, and then you have the tab that appears that you have the option of making a submission to the Federal Housing Advocate. There you're able to download the form. Again, it's available in French and English. And then basically the tool could take 15 minutes to fill out, but it could take 2 hours. We have people that are sharing a lot of stories, so depending on the time and resources that you guys have. But for the individual form, it's basically 2 parts. So the first part will ask you a series of questions about your experiences with inadequate housing or homelessness, but it also asks you how you would like personally to get your housing concerns solved or resolved. And then, so yeah, that's the first part. The second part will ask you some socioeconomic and demographic information. So that's where you're actually able to talk a bit more about yourself, where you come from, where you live, etc. Of course, providing personal information is optional, but of course, it's very helpful if you guys decide to do it. And like the more you share, that's how we're actually building part of our knowledge on your experiences and your story that you're actually willing to share with us. So when you get to the tool, you go down that page and you have the option of either making a submission for an individual or for an organization, NGO, etc. So the forms are slightly different, shorter for organizations. I'll speak to that a bit later. Right, okay. So next slide. Okay, so this is the first main question that we have on the tool. I mean, it's just how we're breaking up the categories of housing issues. They're all there. On that side, we have, I don't want to count it, but it's something like, we've extended that list. So it's actually based on the 7 basic criteria that we've seen in the video earlier about adequate housing, but with the help of like research that has been doing consultation collaboration with our partners, we've made the list wider to just get a fuller picture. And for each of these housing issues that the person selects, I mean, there's not a minimum. You could select all of the issues if, unfortunately, that's the case for you. And then you will have some sub-questions for each of these, and you're able to share whatever you want. There's also the option of just like not selecting anything and just typing in what you want to type in. That's also an option. And then we also ensure that there's like open text fields throughout the text, throughout the tool, to indicate individual experiences, details, anecdotes, anything that people are willing to share with us. So it's really about the stories and about the quality of what we're actually receiving, not necessarily the numbers. Okay, so this is like first part of the tool, and then I skip quickly to the last part. So the last question of the submission tool is about priority groups. I think it's a big piece of what we're actually doing here. So just having this focus on specific groups. That question we're asking is actually if the person that's filling out the tool and other members in their household. So the question is actually directed to the full household, if any of those people identify with any of the following groups, so you're able to select all of the groups that actually apply to your household, not just yourself. So it gives us, again, like a fuller picture of households and not just participants itself. And then again, we've extended the list from the NHS that was published in 2018, right? So originally it had 11 groups, and we actually extended those groups to have 20 in total. And like Ruby said earlier, we're actually working to extend even more that list, for example, single parents, single mothers, just to have even more categories for us to be working with and to be able to analyze the trends of like which groups are facing which issues. So that's why I just kind of quickly showed just those 2 questions, but the tool is a bit more, has more to it, right? And then I wanted to show just, okay, so this is the last slide, the last page, of the organization form of the submission tool. So for example, for organizations, how it works, you have a first page where we're asking you where you work, which population are you helping, what region you're working and etc. So basic stuff about what you are actually doing. You have some housing issues questions where you're actually able to share what you're testifying. But then the last page is about, it's just about for you guys to upload some files. So it could be, I just basically put it up there saying that there are no expectations of what people are able to upload. It could be a one-pager, it could be anything that actually people are willing to submit. We are conscious that not all organizations have the same resources or the same capacity to make like 10, 20, 30 pages reports. That's not necessarily what we're looking for. If you're willing to submit that and you're willing to do it, like, of course, but it's not an expectation at all. So we're really happy to receive pretty much anything. Like, we've received like half a page paragraphs just for us to know what you're actually living on out there, right? So that's always appreciated. Okay, so this is, right, okay, I split it. Okay, I wanted to share some of the stuff we've been collecting. So it's hard for us to actually go with very in-depth numbers because it's relatively new, but I just wanted to share a couple of like housing issues and trends that were identified with the submission tool. So I'm sharing a couple of quotes. So the first one is from a person that has many disability. According to the act, the person actually has 8 disabilities. And so I just wanted to read this quote. I'm not able to read it here, so I'll read it out here. But the person says, "We were forced into buying a tiny condo in order to have something even slightly wheelchair accessible. We have 400 square feet for 2 adults, and I can't use mobility aids in the house because it's too small. We have an elevator and a level entrance, but no power doors or any other adaptation." So that person that has disability under the Act is part of the 56.5 total submissions that we've received actually are people that are actually from household that at least one person has a disability. And like, this is nothing new for you guys because I feel you guys have a lot of research background, and for us, I mean, we're just starting collecting this information, but what we're seeing is that many of the participants that have disability are forced to move into places that are either like totally unaffordable for them or not suitable for their conditions. And so this group, from what we've collected, but again, we're starting with this, but like what we've collected, the average of disabled people are actually paying 60% of their income on household, on housing, and that's actually compared to the average of all submissions, which stands at 47% of participants' income spent on housing. So the numbers are, I mean, probably not new to anyone here, probably higher than what we're actually collecting. But yeah, it's pretty concerning. Okay, the second quote I want to share is from a woman who actually moved back with her sister. They're both in their early 30s, actually, and they are both full-time employees, and they moved back together as they couldn't afford their housing anymore. And then she says, "Housing that is reasonably desirable is way too expensive and diminishes my ability to make decisions about starting a family, education, changing jobs. Housing is a human right, and there should be ample housing so it's cheap to have the bare minimum." And so this woman is actually part of like the total of 91% of submissions of people that are actually saying that housing isn't affordable. And that's, I mean, it's very expensive right now. We all know about it. So, but that unaffordability is what we're seeing right now is, of course, mainly affecting women, people with disabilities even higher, and then also young adults. Finally, last one, and I'm almost done after. This last quote is from an Indigenous woman that lives with her husband and 4 children. They together as a household spend 50% of their income in housing. And that woman is actually part of the 6% of submissions we've received from Indigenous people, which is extremely low. Like, we're not, of course, there's a lot of work to do. Maybe the Northern visit would help a little bit. We're actually working with our partners on an outreach strategy for the submission tool to actually go into remote locations, to be promoted to the north, and to, I mean, we're conscious of the work that we have to do, of course. And then eventually, when we have more data and then we're ready to share, the data will eventually be public on our website. And I don't want to go too much into the detail. Oh, I skipped it, sorry. But I just want to go, I know we've been receiving questions about this, so I want to touch a bit upon, like, on it. how does it work when we're receiving submissions? How do we choose it? How we actually make the process of like, what are the next steps after a submission or after we're actually identify a systemic housing issue, right? So there are a lot more steps than this. I mean, we've put in a lot of thought into it and a lot of conversation with our partners, but basically what it is. After we've analyzed it, I mean, we have to identify a systemic housing issue. How do we do that? It's a lot more complex than that, but basically it comes from submissions that we've actually received, but also from research, monitoring, engagement, and other activities like this conference. That's where we're actually picking up on a lot of like what's happening on the ground right now, right? And once that is done, we have to prioritize specific issues with the human rights considerations, which includes, among a lot of other factors, but like the severity of impacts of the issue on specific people. But again, like we have to consider which party groups will be affected and how. So those are all the questions that we have to ask ourselves before we actually make a selection. Once that is done, we have to determine what's missing, like what we would need to get, or to, like what we're missing to actually push this issue for a review, or it could be for any other intervention. And so, like, yes, we're part of the government, but we're an extremely small team. We only have 2 research analysts, so it's, I mean, completely impossible for us to represent the full country, of course. So that's where we have to gather evidence, research. Like Ruby said, we have a lot of partners across the country. So that's the goal, to engage with rights holder duty bearers in all provinces and all territories, which is a big task. It's a lot on one person's shoulder or team's shoulder, but that's something that we have to consider, right? Resources and stuff like that. And I skipped, so that strategic, that was actually also part of the strategic consideration. That's where that process is also we're still working on it. It's not very defined even for us yet, but, and then finally, when we're set on a specific issue, so for example, for the financialization issue that has been discussed for a couple of times, like we had to have this conversation of what's the best intervention for that specific issue. Yes, it could be an advocate-led review, as we mentioned before. It could be a review panel by the National Housing Council, but sometimes we have other interventions that are possible. So that includes, for example, research engagement, like we talked before, letters of concerns, letters to mayors, municipality, etc. So there are a couple of things we're able to do, not just reviews themselves. Okay, so I'll stop here. I actually wanted to share some resources. I think the PowerPoints will be available, but I wanted to ask that we actually have some printed forms in front if people are interested in filling out by hand. And we also have some documents with the QR code for the link to the submission tool if you'd rather just scan it and keep it in your phone, or take the French or the English version. We actually have those documents up front if you guys are interested. So thank you.
Thank you, guys. We will be quick. We just wanted to introduce you folks to what we as the National Right to Housing Network are doing to bridge community organizers, people, frontline service providers, et cetera, all of us housing advocates across the National Right to Housing movement, to this process, and to our power holders at the federal level. We really want to be holding feet to fire to make sure that this legislation that cemented the right to housing in Canada is meaningfully implemented. And so we'll walk you through some of what we're doing, the systemic issues we're looking at, and this is really more of an interactive process. I think my colleague Michelle has prepared some survey things we can do on our phone for you folks to let us know what you're working on, the issues that are concerning you most, et cetera. So please feel free to have your cell phones available to participate. And I should introduce myself. My name is Sahar, and I'm also a director of policy and communications, which is very confusing because Bahar also is director of policy and communications. I always have to name it because it's funny. And Michelle, do you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Biss, and I'm the National Director of the National Right to Housing Network. And like Sahar, as a Michelle, I am very familiar with people getting my name confused as a Michelle born in the 80s. Yeah.
There's a lot of Michelles.
Yeah.
There's a lot of Michelles. All right. Can I get, I have the next slide. There we go. So brief agenda of what we're going to go through. Quickly about who we are, where we came from, some of the systemic issues that we're working on. We're doing some research right now about how we can resource rights claimants to engage with this federal housing advocate process, with the review panels, et cetera. I mean, these are new systems, so there's not a lot of support in place yet to get people to the table, and especially lived experience folks, so that's going to be something that we really want to support. And then finally, we'll be brainstorming with you about what are the systemic barriers that we should be focusing on, what kind of organizing should we be prioritizing as a civil society network, and yeah, what you think needs to happen to end homelessness. What do the solutions look like in your eyes? Oh, this is Michelle. I'm going to pass it to you.
Okay, so I'm going to make an incredibly privileged assumption that people have access to some sort of electronic device. And we're going to try to do something electronic. Please bear with me, and we're going to hope that this works. Here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I'm going to ask you to go to a website called www.menti.com. Right there, and I'm going to ask you to put in the code 65945516. And there you're going to see a poll, and in there you'll be able to make a note of how familiar are you with the right to housing. And they can they'll keep using the code throughout. Pour les personnes qui est dans le salon, qui parle français, la question est, dans quelle mesure connaissez-vous le droit au logement? Et je m'excuse parce que mon français est pas... Oh, oui. Sorry, the code? Yes. 65945516. And our amazing tech person, Steven, we're going to try out our thing. We're going to go to the browser. Yes! Success! Okay, very interesting. Very interesting. Okay, so top option, 49% of respondents so far, 47 now, okay. Somewhat familiar and peu familier, okay. Very familiar. This makes me very happy. Can I say often when we're talking about the right to housing and claiming the right to housing, 5 years ago, I feel like we would have been way more in the other two categories. It's very encouraging to me. Very interesting. Okay, we're going to slip now back to the PowerPoint presentation. Thank you, Stephen. Okay, next slide, Sahar.
All right. Okay, with that context, we'll not give you too much information about the right to housing, but what we will tell you, maybe to build off of Bahar's story, was that where she left off, we had organized to pass the legislation, but all of the advocates, as Michelle often says, just kind of looked at each other and were like, man, the government is going to mess this up, and we need to hold feet to the fire and make sure that they actually implement this legislation in a meaningful way with engagement, with rights claimants, with civil society, et cetera. And so that was pretty much how the Right to Housing formed, the Right to Housing Network formed. Michelle was the first staff person, I was the second, and we were slowly growing to build our capacity so that we can organize around systemic issues, create working groups, connect people to government actors, we call ourselves the connective tissue. Of the movement. We kind of just want to make things happen, keep it going, keep the energy, build the movement. So that's what we are. And yeah, Michelle, do you want to say more?
Nope.
All right. Okay, so can I get the next? Oh, no, that's me. I need to stop doing that. All right. Did I skip one? No.
No, I think you're good.
Okay, so systemic cases related to the right to housing. What is in the works? I will tell you about one, and then I'll pass it to Michelle. Because the one that I am very passionate about is, there's actually two. So there's a lot of folks here are from the Women's National Housing and Homeless Network claim, and we had a symposium this week, and there was a sister claim about Indigenous homelessness amongst women and gender diverse folks. So that's a huge systemic issue that we're really focusing on, and our partners at the Women's Network are kind of driving that forward. We're just playing a supportive role. And another really big one for us is one of our steering committee members, Janine Harvey, is an Inuit activist an advocate in the Northwest Territories, and has been telling folks for years how reprehensible the housing conditions are. There are so many accessibility barriers to folks in the North even entering these conversations, and the internet, There's just a million reasons why it's very difficult. And so what we're working with Janine on is we got some funding so that she can essentially track the housing inadequacy across her community and 2 other Indigenous communities in Northwest Territories, and then create a report with community-led solutions based in the right to housing and reconciliation and decolonization principles. So those are 2 of them. Pass it to Michelle.
Okay, so what I wanted to say here really, and I'm going to talk about, these are some of the big ones that have caught our radar or that we're really involved in. And what I wanted to say is that I think that there is a ton of systemic claims that are not listed here, that are in people's minds, that are in the works, that we can make together. And I also really wanted to say something important here. I feel like, it's interesting. We labeled this session as claiming the right to housing, and we're focusing on the National Housing Strategy Act. And I know my heart and soul is always pushing the National Housing Strategy Act. This is what access to justice is. Look at how we're trying to do it. But the truth is, it comes from us. It comes from rights claimants. And when we look past the National Housing Strategy Act, once we get those beautiful, Chris, Marie-Josée, I'm looking at you. Once we get those beautiful findings and recommendations from you, from the review panel, then it's up to us, because then they have to be implemented. And that's on our shoulders as civil society, as rights claimants, as people on the ground. We have to mobilize behind those recommendations. So I say to this room, I think when we're thinking about systemic claims, I myself am thinking about what is going into that submission tool, but also how are we organizing together on the implementation piece, and what happens after the National Housing Strategy Act? How else can we be thinking together? So other systemic issues, though, that are in the works that I wanted to flag for folks. Of course, and this has been a really, I think, firm focus of Marie-Josée and the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate. They've done so much thinking about this. And in fact, we've had the total pleasure of working with them on the question of the National Housing Strategy is not meeting its goals of core housing need and reduction of homelessness, and in fact supposed to be ending chronic homelessness by 2030, though we have no strategy to get there. So how do we ensure the National Housing Strategy is consistent with the National Housing Strategy Act? A ton of work being done by this around advocates across the country, 100 different ways. This is something so firmly in our sights, and also specifically named in the National Housing Strategy Act, how the National Housing Strategy and related housing programs are coherent and adhering to the National Housing Strategy Act and the right to housing. A big one I know on the minds of a lot of folks, and very excitingly will be the very first review panel, woohoo, is financialization of housing. I hope folks were in the session this morning. Whew, it was really, really good, but I know when I speak to advocates across the country, I think that there's a lot more submissions. I'm so sorry, there's going to be so many more submissions through your tool on financialization of housing, REITs, ways folks are being mass evicted in ways that are, I'm from the city of Ottawa, traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. When we talk about financialization, I'm from a community not far from Heron Gate. I think it hits home for a lot of us in big ways. For those living in encampments, another really big one. I think that there's going to continue to be a ton of submissions, a lot of organizing. But we've named these here, and I'll pause because I'd like to go to the next polling kind of question. But I wanted to kind of say here, submissions I think can be big. They can be small, they can be coordinated between a ton of us, they could be, coordinated by just some of us, but that organizing piece I think is one that's really firmly in our minds. How do we organize behind these submissions and make them live to make the right to housing really mean transformative change? Okay, sorry, I'm on slides. Okay. Here we go. I'm on this one, yes, I'm on this, okay. Yes, so again, the code is here, and I'm going to switch. Stephen, you're on. Thank you. Yes, okay. Oh, beautiful. People have already done it. Oh, yes. What systemic Barriers to housing, do you see? Quel obstacle systémique au logement voyez-vous? Okay, lack of affordable housing, lack of low-income housing, housing that fails to meet a variety of needs, evictions, yes, discrimination, lack of affordable housing, yes. Congregate shelter not working, shelters, yes, yes, big one. Inadequate basic income, yep, income support, interactions, inflation, rent evictions, yes. How are we for, yeah, okay, affordable housing. Rent's too high. Wow. Aging out of care into homelessness. Yes. Yes. Yes, I wonder, okay, depending on time, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pick the three of them that see my eyes, and I'm going to take the opportunity. I'm sorry to the people online because this won't be as exciting for you. But folks in the room, I'm going to pick three, and for those who are willing, please don't feel put on the spot. I'm going to call out some of these, and if you feel like putting up your hand and saying this resonates with me, I want you to do it. Okay? Okay. I saw tons of housing affordability. Who's interested in mobilizing on that? Yes. Look around the room, my friends. Look at the power in this room. Okay, I'm going to pick another one. Okay, I'm going to pick aging out of care. Yes. These are the people who want to make systemic claims on this, who want to see change on this, who want to mobilize, not just with a submission, because the NHSA is beautiful, but with a submission, but also after those submissions to organize. Yeah. I saw failure to implement a robust GBA plus, that's gender-based analysis plus, analysis and policy development, yes. Lack of accessibility, yes. I've seen some that kind of connect to that income support, basic income, lack of lack of income. Anyone interested in mobilizing on income and the interaction with housing and affordability? Yes, yes. Let's look at the power in this room. I want you all to look at each other and use these opportunities to connect, to make systemic claims, use this tool, and we will find ways to connect and organize around this. Okay, Stephen, pop me back. Okay, resourcing rights claimants. This is a big question for us because I don't know. I've been part of the right to housing movement is my heart and soul, and I've been part of it for a long time. I'll say before this role, I was at an organization called Canada Without Poverty. Some of you who've been around the block for a while might know it as the National Anti-Poverty Organization, or NAPO. Woot woot! Lived experience advocacy. Woot woot! But I wanted to say here, we've got to talk about how people are using this tool and what they need to feel like we're really moving the dial, like we're making the right to housing live. We call this resourcing rights claimants. I don't know that that's the right word. We have to think about that. I don't know. We'll revisit. We'll rebrand it. Oh no, wait, that's me. There we go. And we've been doing a little bit of research at the National Right to Housing Network to say, for people to use the National Housing Strategy Act, to make a submission, to organize around it, what do you need from this mechanism for it to work for you? And we've had a couple of findings. So one big finding we're hearing from folks, we need recommendations and findings to mean something as access to justice. This is access to justice we are talking about. We don't want another consultation process. Woof! We do not want another consultation process. We need this to mean something. This is a theme we're seeing when we're talking to folks about what the NHSA could mean. If we push the boundaries, if we push what this means, I think Bahar told the story. No, but one of you told the story. Bahar told the story of the right to housing, in Canada. And Bahar, when you told that story, like, we'd been pushing the right to housing for such a long time, and folks, we were pushing the boundary of what this meant. And like a lot of folks in this room know, when we got the National Housing Strategy Act, that was a battle. So how do we make the recommendations, how do we make the process out this? We're going to have to battle again. We're going to have to keep pushing the boundaries. So how do we make this genuinely access to justice? Second point, we need transparency, a clear end goal, and an answer to the so what when we make a submission. We want those beautiful data points. We want to collaborate, but we also want to know what's going to happen if we participate in these processes. A big question mark for a lot of us is we need funding for rights claimants and community-based organizations. There's a couple of really cool programs out there. For those that don't know about it's different, but for those who don't know about the Community-Based Tenant Initiative at the Community Housing Transformation Center, that is a pretty cool program. I encourage folks to check out. It's a funding program for that's more like tenant organizing. But there are ways that we need to think about what resources are out there and then what specific program needs to exist, a funding program to ensure people can make claims. We have things like in Ontario, this is so Ontario biased, I apologize, but there's the legal aid test case funding, which is limited but very useful to pursue some of the most important litigation in this country. There's the Court Challenges Program of Canada that's been really important to pursue equity rights claims. So what's going to exist to make sure that the National Housing Strategy Act mechanisms aren't a consultation process, but are legal, are an access to justice process? Because to do that, people need to be well-funded to organize, to mobilize, to have the research they need behind them, to have the human rights framework and expertise that they need behind them. We also need non-monetary supports, communications, administration, human rights legal expertise, and research support. And we also need opportunities to organize around submissions and collaborate as civil society to build out the movement. So I don't know if folks ever was anyone around during the Court Challenges program in its heyday? It did some cool, yeah, there was some really neat things looking at that model of ways that the Court Challenges program would hold annual meetings as annual general meetings, and tons of civil society folks would have side events. Actually, I think some of that's happened with this conference, but they would use this federally funded mechanism to organize. And some of the coolest pieces of social movements, of litigation, of big movement challenges came out of those side events, especially in the anti-poverty movement. Yeah, please.
One other thing that we should just name is that a lot of folks have also voiced that, especially amongst racialized and Indigenous communities, there's a lot of mistrust and broken trust with government institutions. And it's like, if there's no guarantee of justice, why would people put their time and energy into another system which is still being literally formed as we speak? And so I think one thing we don't have up here, but we are very conscious of, as folks raised, we need to give some immediate outcomes to build that trust, to build that relationship, so that there can be long-term mobilization and systemic change as well. So it's been heard, and definitely something I would like to talk further about with all of you.
Okay, ready? Okay, next one here. You should have the code. The code will come up on this one. It'll come up and I'll read it out. Oh no, we did this already. Next one. Beautiful, thanks, Stephen. Okay, what do you need to advance a systemic claim? What do you need for this to work for you? Et en français, de quoi avez-vous besoin pour faire avancer une revendication systémique? Time, research, funding, guidance. I don't know what I don't know, yeah. An accessible guide, education, a chance to think clearly, whew, yeah. Can we scroll down a bit, Stephen? I don't know if this one does the thing. Oh, yeah, okay. Responses from government that isn't a stumpy reply. Okay. Administrative and research legal support, funding, and guidance. A team. That I think resonates with a lot of us. We need to organize together. We need a team. That's, I think, one of the things that changes this from a consultation into an access to justice moment. political will, access to transformative justice, money. Stephen, could we scroll down a little? These are, yeah, beautiful, thank you. Policy change, better understanding of how to present systemic versus individual, yes. Proper legal information and clear ways to strategize, money, how to advocate, a reason, what is the point? Yes, I think that resonates with all of us. And I think that the way to make this what is the point, some of that lies with us to make it meaningful. PowerPoint again. I promise we're almost done. Okay. And the last question I want to hit upon before we wrap up and into some larger questions and discussion, I'd like to just touch upon this point on brainstorming solutions to systemic barriers. I think there's a lot in the National Housing Strategy Act process that I think we're going to be engaged in, thinking about process, how to make this a really rights-based process. But let's also think about what do we want to see at the end of this? What are the ways to end homelessness? We've heard, I think, through the day in Angela Robertson's keynote this morning was talking a lot about, we know that homelessness was caused by bad law policy. It's a systemic issue. What are the systemic solutions that people think need to happen to end homelessness? I'm really curious about that question. Here's the PowerPoint, and then ready? Yeah. Oh, yes, we can also do. Yes, we have the best tech person. Yeah. Okay. What solutions are necessary to remove systemic barriers? Quelles solutions sont nécessaires pour supprimer les obstacles systémiques? Et je m'excuse pour mon français. Universal income, bottom-up governance, yes. More affordable housing stock, yes. Affordable, accessible, and acceptable housing, political will. Add housing to increase capacity. Regulated supportive housing. Make financialization illegal, yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. More centering of lived experience in research, yes, totally. These are really good. Money, yeah. Income, yeah. Affordable housing, municipalities at the table. Rent control, ooh. Yeah. Clear outline of how housing can be decommodified, yeah. And big questions, about how we, through our organizing, are going to bring different levels of government and different levels of the movement who are working local, provincial, territorial, national. Yeah, decommodification of housing. Yeah. Okay, I think we're about to move on to the questions because that's the end. Do you want to do that, or is there? Okay, yeah, that's correct. Okay. So with that, why don't we open up to questions or discussion even of some of the stuff we talked about? Yeah?
Thank you so much. That was amazing. And it keeps coming. Yes, Daniela.
Sorry, I was afraid to put up my hand. I'm so glad. I wanted to reach out to you earlier, but I'm 18 now as a senior, and one of the things I need help with, and I would like to use my story to get a human rights claim, is, I'm now paying a market rent that's very high. I work very hard. My CPP barely covers my rent. I know we've been talking about, 30% here. So am I right? So I'm actually paying about 80% of my rent. So I have to work, and I work really hard and passionately. The threshold of CPP is $24,000. I went over $40 on the $24,000 threshold, was cut back by $100 a month on CPP. My thing is, you know what? Take the $40 and give me my $1,200. So ultimately, but a lot of seniors are not living in subsidized housing. I saw a lady at Loblaws had to put back a piece of meat because she couldn't afford it. Why are we keeping seniors in such poverty? We need to look at, just like if it was with ODSP, what are you paying on rent? right? So I just wanna, and I would like to use this as a case. Can I get some help, some lawyer who will do some pro bono and make this an issue for all of us? It needs to be addressed. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I can, do you want me to respond?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks, Danielle. Oh, is this one work?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, okay. Thank you, Daniela. Let's connect after. I think there's, I don't know, like sorry, this is big kind of macro thinking, but as I'm resonating and thinking about your excellent point about the right to housing and seniors and income but you know, when you think about the right to housing and how it's being implemented in Canada, legal rights, like it's so disconnected, you know, like based on where you're at in the country and access to legal services, you know, be it a big systemic thing or based on individual situations, we're really disconnected, I would say, as a movement. And so to do some thinking, and I have to admit that I do the terrible lawyer thing of when people give me a systemic issue, I want to break it apart into legal actions that we can take at different levels. But there's a lot of thinking, I think, that we as a movement need to do about how we can build out the capacity of the whole sector to make sure that we're strategically pointing people to legal supports where they exist in their region to be able to push forward these different elements, right? Like, how do we push forward advocacy on income support for seniors at all levels of government? How do we do it in terms of affordability guidelines at the federal level? Anyway, we should talk, Daniela, but.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you for that. So just for everyone online as well, the question and comment was really about the experience of seniors paying market rent, paying too much rent, and not living in subsidized housing. And it's really important to have that affordability. Exactly. Thank you. Yes, please.
Very inspiring, everything you're all doing. I want to kind of speak to what you just said. I think rent geared to income is something that should be very accessible to anybody who needs it based on their individual situation. Sometimes it seems like, social housing kind of, I don't know, in cahoots with, not with the financialization and everything you're talking about, with not supporting people the way that they should, and like increasing rents disproportionate to what people need and what people, for example, there's a lot of young people who have enormous student debt, and if you live in social housing, it doesn't matter at all. So, whatever your gross income, nothing else is taken into account. There was also, on one of your slides, something about a mother of 6 who couldn't get, I don't remember exactly what it was, but she couldn't get any RGI, any rent-geared income or support, even though she needed it.
Yeah,
So I
exactly.
think that, having CEOs of something like Toronto Community Housing, corporations that should be social safety nets, at these kinds of conferences would be really useful.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Yeah, RGI, rent geared to income, should be accessible to anyone. And it really isn't. And it's the stock is too low. It is inaccessible. The wait lists are quite long across the country. And I really like that point about young people as well. There's so many people carrying debt, and it should be more accessible for all.
Bahar, can I add something?
Yes, please.
Just because I'm really on the co-op wave right now, so I think we should also be talking about like co-op housing, intergenerational housing. I know as an immigrant, and I know a lot of people can relate, even if you're not immigrants, but like we strongly believe in the intergenerational structure of living. I want to be able to live with my parents into old age, and there's just not housing supply for that kind of lifestyle where you can live independently and still be with your community. So we should really be exploring those kinds of options, yeah.
Ooh, I love that. Keep on that, man.
Great. Thank you.
I got you. You can come to my co-op.
Yes. Oh, we were okay, right?
Yeah, I know.
I'm just going to go to this side of the room. Yes, please.
I think there has to be an awareness of the growth of senior workers, and especially senior workers who are self-employed or run their own small business, and the lack of ability for seniors now to retire. Many of us will not be able to retire any longer, and as we are building our senior housing stock, we're finding senior housing in care facility, retirement facilities costing somewhere to around $20,000 a month, which is insane, which only means that we're going to have a severe drop with our demographics and the growth of seniors in this country very,
Yes.
very soon.
Yes.
Like I'm saying in like maybe 5 years, it's going to be so severe.
We're not ready for that.
Because how can any senior who has started, I started working when I was 5 years old here, throughout their life, face a $20,000 a month rental price, and that is what we're building. If you go to any senior's residence, that's the cost.
Yeah.
It's scary.
Yeah.
And we have about 5 years to consider how we're gonna deal with that avalanche.
Absolutely. That's a really interesting and great point that you make, the not being able to retire, working indefinitely and not having those housing options.
And the
Fo-
constant stress and anxiety around that, just, you know, in terms of mental health and just health period.
Absolutely.
It's huge.
Yeah. Any comments from the panelists on that? Thank you for that.
I know, I really like it. You're a panelist.
And yes?
When you're looking at the national housing strategy, are you looking at the funding programs like Reaching Home and how they need to be decolonized and how they create actually discrimination in systemic areas, the regulations in Reaching Home, that organizations have to pay their landlords instead of, and so people, BIPOC, people are facing discrimination not only because of the color of their skin, but because they're receiving funding from an organization, and so that can create problems with landlords, and they can be denied housing because of it.
Thank you so much. So the question for the panelists was that when looking at the National Housing Strategy, as an example, the Reaching Home funding stream, how can that be decolonized, and ensuring that it doesn't cement already, discriminatory actions and behaviors? Anyone from the panel?
Yes, okay.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, that was going to be my answer too. Yes, absolutely. But probably not as well. We're probably not doing it as substantially as we should. So please come talk to us after this session, and I will give you my email so we can build that out in a lot of the recommendations we make. I think I'll tell you, we did some research. I'm really, really proud of this research. So I'm going to talk about the research. But we did some really cool research that was supported by the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate on what it takes to revise the National Housing Strategy under the Right to Housing, international human rights, and concepts like a maximum of available resources, engagement and co-creation, amplifying the voices with people with lived experience of inadequate housing and homelessness, looking at prioritizing specific groups who are most in need under an international human rights framework to say, this is the individual policy changes you could make to make the National Housing Strategy coherent with the National Housing Strategy Act, because the National Housing Strategy 2017 was not created at the when the National Housing Strategy was released in 2017, the National Housing Strategy Act did not yet exist, and the right to housing was not as strong as it is today. And so all that to say, yes, absolutely, reforms to Reaching Home, taking a decolonized approach, not just to Reaching Home, but actually to all of the housing programs under the National Housing Strategy, has been a point in our research, but not as much as it should be, probably. And if you want to come talk to us about what the individual policy pieces of that are, please, please, please do that. Okay. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, was just going to reiterate, please do talk to us seriously, because I think us and the office are really focused on reforming the NHS. Like, that's a priority in the coming months, especially around National Housing Day. Not to let the cat out of the bag, but we'll be having, and we have an event coming up as well about this. So would love to amplify whatever you think needs to be amplified.
And did you want to speak to that as well? Okay. Yes, please.
I'm still looking at this question here, so you'll have to excuse me. Are REITs and financialization on the radar, and are things being done about it? Because that affects everybody, and especially seniors, because the private organizations that have billions of dollars are given the funding to build. And this is the 6 to 20,000 and not the provincial. So that's on the radar?
Oh no, were you about to?
Yeah, so I'm just going to repeat the questions for everyone also online. What are we doing about the REITs and the financialization of housing?
Yeah, you should talk about it.
Yeah.
Yes. Hello? Oh, yeah. Yes, absolutely. So I mentioned briefly that the Federal Housing Advocate has referred specifically the financialization of purpose-built rental to the National Housing Council to establish a review panel on the matter. And that will include like a hearing process where they'll call lived experts and academics and other experts on the issue to testify, we presume. And that will, yield what we hope to be a fulsome body of recommendations to the federal government to make some reforms to solve those issues that we're seeing coming out related to financialization. I'll also mention that the HUMA committee, which I can never remember what it stands for, Standing Committee on Human Rights, Skills, and Social Development, they are also aware of the issue. They're aware of the research that our office commissioned that was presented this morning at the conference, and they're holding what's the word I'm forgetting? Like some kind of study on financialization at the HUMA committee as well, which is really exciting. So.
Can I say one tag thing?
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to say a quick thing about the review panel point that you brought up. And also HUMA committee, because that's a good point too. I just wanted to say something about the review panels. I want to hype them up as much as possible and set our expectations real high. And if anyone in the room is associated with the National Housing Council, no pressure. But I wanted to say something that I think is really important for us to know here. And that is when we fought for the National Housing Strategy Act, which, let us remember, is from rights claimants, is from people with lived experience, is from civil society. When we fought, when we tabled that, the first version of that legislation that was tabled wasn't very good. And I don't know if folks remember, this was early 2019 in the Budget Implementation Act. There had to be another push from civil society to amend the National Housing Strategy Act. And one of the pieces in there that we fought for is review panels. We are talking about a hearing. And yes, there are limitations. Has to be a federal issue. It's going to be really hard to do. I do not envy the people at the National Housing Council who have to make that happen. But I really want to say about the review panels, the world is watching. It is important in terms of financialization, what comes out of that. It's important in terms of our organizing and what comes out of that. It's important in terms of building out a beautiful rights process. But this mechanism that civil society rights claimants have built, this review panel piece in particular, is it's an alternate access to justice rights claiming mechanism that has never been tried before. This is brand new. And I will tell you from colleagues who champion economic and social rights in other countries around the world, they are avidly watching what's going to happen. This is going to become a case study for the world in terms of how we value economic and social rights, in terms of the right to housing, the right to health, the right to food. This is really important. And I know, I don't know, I've been told by a lot of colleagues I'm setting expectations too high, which I totally am. But I want our expectations to be high because it's important that this works. And we should fight. Yes. Yes, get the feds and the provincial together. Yeah, absolutely. But then we can mobilize around what comes out of those review panels. Okay.
Oh, and can I add another? Because yes, we are hyped for the review panel, but it might take a while, and who knows what the outcomes will be. I do think we should also acknowledge that there's so much research out there about this already, including what the office has commissioned, including Leilani Farha, former special rapporteur. The Shift has done like financialization guidelines with Caitlin Schwan, who I think is in the bag. So there's so much out there that we can just use for our advocacy as well. And so if that's something folks want to organize around, again. Pardon? And the governments could implement. Exactly. It's like this could happen outside. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Shovel ready.
We just got to organize and hold feet to fire. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Just to follow up on the provincial federal piece, I learned at lunchtime that there's a conference going on not too far from here.
Yes.
Around housing. And some of the organizations that might have been here are thinking, oh, we should be there because we're involved in something. And are there initiatives underway to connect the federal and the provincial governments? Because if that doesn't happen, I can see all these wonderful efforts, just Mr. Ford is just gonna block them
Yes.
and say, oh, that's not, this is our territory, stay out of our business. But I know that's a huge political issue, and I don't envy our advocate, our advocacy office at the federal level, and how you're going to make that happen. But it seems to be, unless we're really deliberate about that,
Yes.
what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, great question. So just for everyone else, how will the federal and provincial governments come together to have common goals, but to actually solve the issues, especially given the different jurisdictions as well? So what can we do? Panelists.
Okay. Yeah, you should chime in too.
No, you're the panelist. I'll speak to this tomorrow. Come to our RET session about rent control.
Okay, so back in 2018, Canada underwent a review by the Universal Periodic Review. Is anyone here familiar with the Universal Periodic Review? Okay, it's the Human Rights Council at the United Nations. It's much more of a political process, but one of the biggest pieces that came out of that process, it's called again the Universal Periodic Review, or UPR, is the need for governments in Canada to implement international human rights obligations and to create mechanisms for all levels of government to implement international human rights obligations, in particular economic, social, and cultural rights, in particular the right to housing. So the government comes out and they create something that is acronymed as the SOCR. I'm going to forget it. But it's a group of folks who meet on all levels of government who are responsible for human rights. Now, I think, I'm going to get my dates wrong now. I think it was back in 2020 that this group met for the second time in 30 years. The meeting we expected to be co-created by civil society. It was not. We expected the meeting to focus on implementation. It was not. Very few of us were invited to the table. Very few of us were invited to engage in that process. However, it's a start, maybe. Maybe we can look at different models, and maybe we could look at different recommendations for different models to have some rooms where we have people responsible for implementation of human rights, people responsible, ministers, deputy ministers, responsible for implementation of the right to housing to come together. Because, and one more thing, I'm so sorry. Okay, one more thing. The bilateral agreements that provide funding from the feds to provinces and territories have a requirement, everyone take notice of this, have a requirement to the progressive realization of the right to housing. It is in there. How are they doing it? How are they implementing it? And what rooms are we holding for them to report on the ways that they are spending that money? How do we make spaces for that? And I will also say that the National Housing Council does a good job of bringing together different actors. So there are some things in the works, but how do we hold more spaces to hold them accountable and hold those rooms?
Thank you so much for that. And to this date, no province or territory has recognized the right to housing formally. Yes? Actually, please, I've seen your hand go up.
I just want to speak to this, to Danielle's point in the beginning about seniors. I live in a seniors residence. I'm not a senior, by the way. There's many people like me in subsidized housing. The thing that bothers me is that there's been elder abuse in the building. We've had harassment of staff. A lot of the seniors are very scared. Again, I'm trying to put a tenant mobilization, something to go on right now. But there's a lot of division amongst what's going on. People are afraid of losing their housing. They want to speak out, but they're afraid. The other thing that bothers me is that people in OW, ODSP, to the point earlier about subsidized housing should be open to anyone. Doesn't matter what your income is, doesn't matter what your situation is. I agree with more co-ops. The problem is with the City of Toronto Housing Portal, you're only limited to one, right? You're only limited to one choice. And what choices are you given? Because there are different levels of housing. I'm also an artist. There is artist housing out there, but again, you have to go through the entire process, which is fine. But I feel like there's these different levels of discrimination. And I've been on a housing list for 20 years, 12 years, through arts, 20 years. And it's ridiculous, right? But the real issue right now is, people are afraid of mobilization. There's this apathy going on. And there has to be better practices of how we can get better creative solutions to either income. Sorry, I lost the train of thought. And also, when we're building housing, how to build better in terms of environmental design.
Mhm.
This is a real
Good
issue.
point.
Thank you.
We're dealing with climate change. In my building, there's been 5 seniors that died on the floor. 5, because of lack of ventilation.
Wow.
This is disgusting. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. And for everyone else, if you didn't hear, you spoke to elder abuse, harassment, and many issues that tenants want to bring up, but they're afraid to speak up. They're afraid to lose their housing. So how do we ensure that they can and that they have those avenues, creative ways to mobilize and have their voices heard? Thank you. And just cognizant of the time, we have 30 seconds for a quick question.
About civil society and public outreach, I think that would be a great way for people to be more engaged. My family as well are immigrants, and I know that the immigration minister just, said that we need more immigration, and 500,000 more immigrants will arrive. So having people understand how to engage with these things, and making more of a maybe robust effort to, but I think a lot of the times people don't know, they're just trying to survive. So getting civil society on board to realize that bullying is in everyone's best interest.
Great point, yes. And so just people need to know about their rights, right? How do they know that? How do they know their options, where to go, get the support from civil society? Well, thank you for all of your comments. Thank you to the panelists for the incredible presentation.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you,
before you
Bahar.
go, 4 points to take away with you. So 1, submissions can be easy. It doesn't have to be long or formal. Just go on the submission portal. If you have something systemic housing issue to speak to, please do so. How do we organize, right, behind these submissions? So it's not just about making the submissions, but making sure those recommendations are implemented. And also pushing for resourcing, right? Civil society needs to be resourced. We need funding. We need staff and personnel to be able to do this. So thank you for being here, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
I was like, why didn't you talk more? You have answers to all these.
Moderator.
No,
moderator.
English, and then if you wanted, yeah, it was good.